The grass had gone silver by June, curled inward at the blade as if trying to protect what moisture it had left. Western Kansas in the summer of 1887 held its heat the way a closed fist holds a coal, tight, constant, without relief. The creek bed was dust. The cottonwood had dropped half its leaves in confusion. Even the dirt gave off warmth after sunset, so the nights felt less like rest and more like the pause between blows. A woman knelt at the edge of a trench she had dug between her cabin and a stone door half buried in the slope. Her hands were wrapped in stained cloth. Beside her, a child's cradle sat on the cellar steps below ground, moved there because the cabin rafters still radiated heat long after dark. Abel Moreau had been dead 11 days when the foreman came for the debt. Elise heard the horse before she saw it. She was kneeling beside the cabin's east wall, pressing a damp rag against Lucian's neck where the sun had burned him raw. The boy was 9 and thin in the way children get thin when meals come twice a day instead of 3. He did not complain about the burn. He complained about the flies. The rider came up the wagon track from the south, and Elise knew the horse before she knew the man, a circle bar bay with a cropped tail. She stood and set Lucian behind her, not because she expected violence, but because the instinct had lived in her body since Abel stopped breathing on the freight road, and the world became a place where she stood in front of things instead of beside them. Cale Bristow dismounted without greeting. He was 42, sun-cracked across the nose, and he wore his authority the way all ranch foremen wore it. In the unhurried way he moved through someone else's yard. He pulled a folded paper from his vest, crossed to the cabin door, and tacked it against the wood with a single nail. The hammer strike rang flat in the heat. "Your husband borrowed winter feed and well water through January," Cale said. He did not look at her while he spoke. He looked at the cellar door, 50 feet north of the cabin, half buried in the slope. $47. Circle Bar wants payment or property by September 1st. Elise had $21 in a tin behind the flour sack. She had 3 hens that laid every other day. She had seed potatoes worth perhaps $6 if anyone was buying, and nobody was buying because the drought had turned western Kansas into a place where people sold things and nobody bought them. $21 against $47. A gap of $26 that might as well have been $2,600. "The cellar and the cabin edition," Cale said, tapping the paper. "That's what settles it. You sign over both, the debt is cleared, and you can stay in the main room through October." Stay through October. As though October were a gift and not a slower way of losing everything. "I will read the paper," Elise said. Cale shrugged. "Read it twice if you like. The numbers don't change." He mounted and rode south without waiting for her answer, because the answer did not matter to him. The Circle Bar wanted the cellar. Abel had known that. The cellar was 22 feet long, 11 feet wide, and 12 feet deep at the sump, lined with local limestone that kept the air cool enough to store beef, milk, and medicine through the worst months. Every rancher within 15 miles knew its value. Abel had borrowed against it the way a man borrows against the only thing he owns that other people want. Elise pulled the nail from the door. The paper left a small hole in the pine. She folded the notice into her apron pocket and looked at Lucian, who had not moved from the east wall. "Are we leaving?" he asked. She did not answer. She was looking at the cellar door. The cabin was a trap, and the heat was its mechanism. 1 room, 16 feet by 14. Pine-board walls, a shingled roof with no insulation, 2 windows that face south and west, the wrong directions for summer. Abel had built it for autumn habitation and planned to add a sod north wall before the following July. He had not lived to see July. By 10 in the morning, the interior reached 85 degrees. By noon, it passed 90. The shingled roof absorbed sun, and radiated it downward so that the air near the ceiling shimmered and the iron stove, cold, unused since April, was too hot to touch by mid-afternoon. Elise cooked outside over a fire pit. She hauled water from a shared well 3/4 of a mile east, and by the time she carried it back, the bucket was warm. Lucian had fainted twice in May. The first time she thought it was hunger. The second time she knew it was heat. She moved his pallet to the floor, where the air was marginally cooler, and hung a damp sheet from a ceiling rope to block the worst of the radiant heat from the roof. It helped for perhaps an hour each morning. By afternoon, the sheet was dry, and the cabin was an oven with a door. She could not leave. There was no family to receive her. Her parents were dead in France. Abel's brother had gone to California and stopped writing. Passage east cost money she did not have. The nearest town, Larned, offered laundry work at $3 a week, but $3 a week would not close $26 of debt by September, and leaving the cabin unoccupied gave Cale legal ground to claim abandonment. The Circle Bar's lawyer in Dodge City had written the terms carefully. Elise had read the paper twice, as Cale suggested. The numbers did not change. She was pinned. By debt, by heat, by a nephew who could not survive another summer in a pine box, and by a cellar she could not afford to lose because it was the only cool ground on the property. The cellar. She had gone down the limestone steps the morning after Abel's funeral, carrying a crate of milk jars to store below ground. The air hit her ankles first. It rose from the sump like water from a spring. Not cold the way winter is cold, but cold the way stone is cold when it has not seen the sun in years. She had stood there with her arms full of glass jars and felt the sweat on her neck stop forming. 44 degrees at the sump. She knew because Abel had hung a mercury thermometer on a nail beside the lowest shelf, and she had read it by lamplight while the milk jars clinked against each other. 44 degrees below, 91 degrees above, and between them 50 feet of Kansas dirt baking in the sun. Lucian had followed her down. He sat on the lowest step and stopped shaking. His breathing slowed. His skin cooled. He looked at her with the expression children wear when pain stops, and they do not yet trust its absence. "Can we stay here?" he asked. "No," she said. "We cannot live in a cellar." But she did not climb the steps immediately. She stood in the cool dark and listened to the earth settle around her and thought about her father. Doctor. Anson Pike arrived on the 3rd day of June, not because Elise sent for him, but because the Pawnee Creek settlement had learned to expect him when the heat turned dangerous. He was 58, former Army contract doctor, and he carried a leather bag that smelled of carbolic acid and whiskey in roughly equal measure. He had buried more children than he had saved on the plains, and the knowledge sat in his face like a scar that had healed flat. He examined Lucian in the yard because the cabin was too hot to work in. He checked the boy's pulse, pressed a thumb against his lower eyelid, and asked when he had last urinated dark. "Yesterday," Elise said. Pike set Lucian in the shade of the cabin's west wall. There was no other shade. The single cottonwood stood 60 yards north near the creek bed, which had been dry since April de Mar, and turned to Elise. "He cannot take another spell like May," Pike said. "A child his size loses water faster than you can replace it hauling from that well. You need shade, wet ground, and a roof that does not cook everything beneath it." "I have the cellar," Elise said. "You have a hole in the ground with one door and no air circulation. You put that boy down there for more than an hour, and you trade heat sickness for damp lung." Pike wiped his hands on a cloth. "I have seen it. Cool air in a closed space turns bad. The child breathes moisture and mold instead of heat. What do you recommend?" "Move into town, work laundry, board the boy with the Tillmans. They have a sod house with ventilation. Come back in October. If I leave, I lose the cabin and the cellar both. The circle bar takes them September 1st. Pike looked at the notice hole in the door. He had seen enough of these to know the arithmetic. Then you are choosing between debt and a child. The sentence hit Elise in the chest. She did not answer it because there was no answer that did not sound like a confession of failure. She looked at the cellar door instead. Pike followed her gaze. He shook his head. I know what you are thinking. It will not work the way you imagine. Cold air does not climb stairs and walk into a room. No, Elise said. It does not climb. It falls. Pike frowned. Then how do you propose to get it from there to here? Elise did not answer. She had not yet found the words for it because the idea was not yet words. It was a feeling in her hands, a memory of stone and candlelight, and her father's voice saying that air, like water, does what the ground tells it to do. Pike left her with a bottle of willow bark tea for Lucian's headaches and a warning that he would check on the boy again in 2 weeks. If the child is worse, he said from the saddle, I am moving him myself, with or without your permission. The dust from his horse settled on Elise's boots. She stood in the yard, $21 from ruin, 47 days from eviction, and 50 feet from the coldest air in Pawnee County. She went to get the cellar key. The memory came that night, lying on the cabin floor beside Lucienne, while the roof radiated the day's heat downward like a second sun. She was 7, the dairy cellar near Clermont-Ferrand. Her father, Marcel Deforge, kneeling beside a crack in the stone wall where the old drain pipe ran under the courtyard to the cheese cave. He held a tallow candle near the crack. The flame leaned, not guttered, leaned steadily toward the dark. Put your hand here, he said. He pressed her palm against the floor near the crack. Cold. Then he lifted it to shoulder height. Warm. Then to the ceiling where the oak beams held the courtyard flagstones. Warmer still. The heavy air lives low, he said. The light air lives high. If you give them each a door, they trade places. The heavy air comes in below. The light air leaves above. The room breathes. She had not understood then. She had been 7, and cheese cellars were simply cold places where her breath turned white and her fingers ached. But her father had been a cooper and a cellar keeper, and he understood that cold air is dense, that warm air rises, and that a room with a low inlet and a high outlet becomes a living system that moves air without machinery. Now she was 29, and the memory had teeth. The cellar sat lower than the cabin. Its sump was 12 feet below grade. The cabin floor sat on joists 18 inches above the dirt. If she could connect the two, see, a covered path running underground at a downward slope from the cabin to the cellar, the heavy, cold cellar air would have a road. And if she cut vents high in the cabin gable, the hot air would have a chimney, low inlet, high outlet. The room breathes. She sat up. Lucian slept with his mouth open, breathing the stale heat. She pulled Abel's ledger from the shelf and turned to a blank page. With a pencil stub, she drew the cabin, the cellar, the ground between them, a line connecting the two below grade, a trench covered with boards, sealed with clay. At the cabin end, a square gate in the floor. At the cellar end, a low opening near the sump where the coldest air pooled. At the cabin gable, 2 pipe vents angled to catch wind. She wrote the numbers. 50 feet of trench, 30 inches wide, 3 feet deep at the shallow end, deepening to meet the cellar wall 4 feet below the surface. The slope had to be continuous. If it dipped and rose, air would pool in the low point like water in a bad drain. She wrote what she needed. Boards for cribbing. Cottonwood would serve. cross braces every 4 feet, clay for ceiling, stovepipe and tin sheet for the roof vents, a hinged gate for the floor opening, leather or oilcloth for the seal. She wrote what she had. 1 shovel, 1 mattock, her hands, Lucian's small hands, and 61 days until September 1st. The pencil stopped. She looked at the drawing. It was not a blueprint. It was a bet. If the trench held and the draft worked, she could cool the cabin enough to keep Lucian alive, preserve food long enough to sell it, and earn the $26 she needed. If the trench collapsed, she would have wasted weeks she could not spare. If the cellar warmed from overuse, she would lose her food stores and her only bargaining chip against the circle bar. She thought of Pike's words. You are choosing between debt and a child. No. She was choosing a third option that no one else could see, and the price of being wrong was everything. The first person to hear the idea was Mara Voss, and the first thing Mara said was no. Mara lived 2 miles northeast in a sod house she had built with her husband before he died of typhoid in '85. She had 3 children, a cow that still gave milk, and a constitution that treated optimism as a disease. She was 34 and looked 45. She came by Elise's cabin every 10 days to trade eggs for soap, and on this particular morning in early June, she found Elise marking a line in the dirt with twine and stakes. What is this? Mara asked, standing at the cabin end of the line with a basket of brown eggs balanced on her hip. Elise explained. The cellar, the trench, the floor gate, the roof vents, the draft that would pull cold air through a buried passage and cool the cabin from the ground up. Mara listened the way she always listened, with her head tilted slightly, as if the words were coming from a direction she did not trust. If cold air wanted to live in your kitchen, Mara said, it would already be there. It does want to. It has no road. Air does not use roads. My father said it does. Heavy air falls. Light air rises. You give them each a path and they trade. Mara set the egg basket down. Your father was a cheeseman in France. This is Kansas. The ground is different. The air is not. Mara looked at the twine line, at the stakes driven into the hard dirt, at the 50 feet of open ground between the cabin and the cellar. She looked at Elise's hands, which were already blistered from digging the first test hole that morning. You cannot dig 50 feet alone before August, Mara said. Even if the trench held, even if the draft worked, you would be dead of exhaustion before you finished. And if you open that cellar to the outside air through a ditch, every degree you let out is a degree your potatoes do not have. You will spoil the food you need to sell and ruin the cold you need to survive. These were not insults. They were calculations, and Elise heard them as such. If I do nothing, Lucian faints again, Elise said. The next time might kill him. Pike said so. Then move him to my soddy. I have room. And lose the cabin, and the cellar, and everything Abel left. Mara picked up her eggs. Abel left you a debt, a hot box, and a hole. You are building a castle from the hole. She walked back toward her wagon without turning around, but she paused at the fence post and said, without looking, if you insist on digging, start before dawn. The ground gives up easier when it still has night in it. It was the closest thing to help Mara Voss had ever offered anyone, and Elise took it. Elise began digging on the 7th of June, 4 hours before sunrise, by lantern light. The ground near the cabin was not the problem. 18 inches of topsoil gave way to dense clay mixed with limestone fragments. She could break the clay with the mattock, shovel the pieces, and clear about 2 feet of trench length per hour in the cool dark. The trench needed to be 30 inches wide at the base, wider at the top to prevent the walls from sliding in. She cut the sides at an angle, the way she had seen French road crews cut drainage ditches along the Claremont Highway, when she was a girl. Sloped walls resist their own weight better than vertical ones. By the time the sun cleared the eastern flat at 5:30, she had opened 4 feet of trench, 18 inches deep. Her shoulders burned. Her palms, already split from 2 days of test holes, bled through the cloth wrappings. She drank a tin cup of water, checked on Lucian, still sleeping on his floor pallet, and ate a cold biscuit with salt pork grease. The mathematics of the project sat on her like the heat. 50 feet at 2 feet per hour meant 25 hours of pure digging, not counting cribbing, drainage, sealing, or the connection cuts at each end. 25 hours across 61 days sounded manageable, but 25 hours assumed no cave-ins, no rock shelves, no storms, no days lost to heat exhaustion, no days spent hauling water or feeding chickens or walking to Larned for nails. She kept a tally on the cellar wall in pencil. Each evening she descended the limestone steps, felt the cool air wrap her ankles, and marked the day's progress. June 7th, 4 feet opened. June 8th, 3 feet. Hit a limestone ledge. Mattock bounced. Right hand swelled. June 9th, 2.5 feet. Lucian carried away 12 pails of loose soil and pebble. He moved slowly, but did not faint. June 10th, nothing. A thunderstorm flooded the open trench and the walls slumped inward. 3 hours of digging erased. She stood in the rain and watched the brown water carry her work away, and she felt the doubt that Pike had named. The voice that said, "You are a cheese man's daughter playing at engineering. You are digging a grave for your own pride. You should take the boy and walk to town and wash other people's clothes until the debt becomes someone else's problem." The voice was loud. The rain was louder. She went inside, dried her hands, and sharpened the mattock with a file. By June 15th, she had cleared 19 feet. 31 remained. 47 days until September 1st. The ratio had improved, but the easy ground was behind her. Ahead lay the midpoint, where the trench crossed a seam of compacted gravel that the mattock skidded across like iron on glass. That was the week Cale Bristow came back. He did not come to the cabin. He came to the store in Larned, where Elise was buying lamp wicks, 2 pounds of nails, and 2 lengths of stovepipe on credit. She had explained to the storekeeper, Tom Adler, that the stovepipe was for ventilation, not heating, and Adler had extended the credit because he was a man who preferred to be owed money rather than lose a customer. Cale was leaning against the hitching rail when Elise came out with her purchases wrapped in brown paper. 2 Circle Bar cowboys sat their horses behind him. Cale watched her load the stovepipe into her small hand cart and said nothing until she turned to leave. "I hear you are digging a ditch from your cellar to your kitchen," he said. Elise stopped. "Tom tells me you bought pipe, nails. You're running a trench underground." Cale smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was the smile of a man who has already won and finds the other person's effort amusing. "She's piping potato breath into her supper room." The cowboys laughed. One repeated the phrase, "potato breath," and the other nodded as though it confirmed something they had discussed earlier. Cale pushed off the hitching rail. "You have 54 days, Mrs. Moreau. That ditch won't cool a house. It won't pay a debt. And when September comes, the Circle Bar will take that cellar and put it to proper use." Elise held the stovepipe against her chest. She could feel the tin warming in the sun. "A woman alone can dig a privy or a grave," Cal said. "She cannot dig weather." She looked at him, the cowboys, the dust, the hitching rail where flies clustered in the shade of the horses. She said, "No, but I can give it a road." Cale frowned. "Roads are for things that move." Elise did not answer. She lifted the handcart and walked north toward the wagon track, and behind her the phrase traveled. Potato breath. By the end of the week, children near the creek called the trench Madame's grave. Someone left a rotten potato on her doorstep. The insult worked because it sounded reasonable. Fruit cellars smell. Underground passages collect damp. A woman digging a channel between a potato cellar and a living room did sound to anyone who had not held a candle to a crack in a dairy wall, like insanity. But the mockery carried a sharper edge than laughter. Cale Bristow wanted the cellar, not out of spite, out of use. The Circle Bar needed cold storage for beef quarters, milk, and medicine, and Elise's cellar, deep and limestone-lined, was the best within 10 miles. If she failed, the cellar became ranch property. If she succeeded, Cale lost access to the most valuable hole in the ground in Pawnee County. Mockery was the first tool. If it did not work, Elise understood there would be others. She went back to digging the next morning. 4 o'clock, lantern hung on a stake, Lucienne asleep in the cabin. The mattock rang on gravel, and the sound carried across the flat like a bell with no church. By June 20th, 23 feet lay open and framed with cottonwood boards she had split from a dead tree near the dry creek bed. The cribbing was rough, boards held by cross pieces notched into the trench walls, but it held. She sealed the joints with clay from the creek bank, pressing it into every gap with her fingers until the seams were smooth. The drainage gutter ran down the center, lined with broken crockery and pebble, sloping toward the cellar so that any water would drain away from the cabin end. 27 feet remained. 41 days. Her hands had stopped bleeding and started hardening. The blisters became calluses. The calluses cracked and bled again, and then they hardened further, and after 3 weeks the shovel handle fit her grip the way a pen fits a clerk's hand. Not comfortably, but inevitably. The physical cost was visible. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her dress hung from her shoulders like laundry on a line. She ate biscuits, salt pork, and boiled potatoes, and sometimes Lucien's egg if he had already eaten one. She drank water until her stomach hurt, and then drank more because Pike had said dehydration kills before hunger does. Lucien carried pebbles in a lard pail, 12 trips a day from the trench to a dump pile behind the cabin. He was learning to work the way children learn to work on the frontier, not because anyone asked, but because the work existed and no one else was doing it. He did not complain, he asked questions. Why does the trench slope? Why are the boards notched? Why do you test with a candle? Elise answered him the way her father had answered her. She showed him. She placed his hand on the cool stone at the cellar floor, and then on the warm board at the cabin threshold. She lit a candle stub and held it at the mouth of the partially completed trench, where the first 8 cribbed feet opened toward the cellar slope. The flame leaned, not much, a shiver, not a tilt toward the dark passage below. But it leaned, and Lucien saw it, and his eyes went wide. "It's breathing," he said. "Not yet," Elise said, "but it will." The trench was not yet connected. The cabin end was open to the air. The cellar end was still 27 feet of unbroken earth away. But even in this incomplete state, the temperature difference between the cool underground passage and the hot surface air created a faint pressure gradient. The flame told the truth. Air wanted to move. The question was whether it would move enough through 50 feet of buried passage to make any difference in a room that reached 96 degrees by noon. Elise did not know. Physics said yes. Experience said nothing because she had no experience. She had a dead father's memory, a pencil drawing in a ledger, and 27 feet of Kansas dirt between her and the answer. If you have ever built something everyone else called foolish before they understood what it was, tell us about it in the comments. Because Elise Moreau was about to find out whether her father's memory was worth more than every practical objection the prairie had thrown at her. and the answer was still buried under 27 feet of earth. She picked up the mattock. The lantern swung on its stake. Somewhere east, a coyote called and received no answer. Lucien carried his pail to the dump pile and came back empty, and the night continued the way all the nights continued that June, with the sound of metal striking earth and a woman counting the feet between what she had and what she needed. 27 feet, 41 days, and the hottest month had not even started. The man appeared on the 26th of June, the day Elise hit the gravel seam that nearly broke the mattock handle. She had been swinging for an hour. The blade skated across compacted stone and pebble fused together by decades of pressure, and each strike sent a jolt through her wrists that she felt in her teeth. The trench was 26 feet long. 24 remained. The gravel seam ran at an angle across the line she had staked, and she could not go around it without curving the trench, which would create a low point where cold air would pool instead of flowing. She was on her knees in the trench, chipping at the seam with the mattock's pick end, when a shadow fell across the opening above her. The man was tall and narrow, 63 years old, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he worked. He wore a canvas coat despite the heat and carried a bedroll in a mason's bag, a heavy canvas sack with leather straps, the kind that held chisels, plumb lines, and pointing trowels. His name was Odrin Belos, and he had been walking west from a rail camp near Great Bend for 4 days. He did not introduce himself immediately. He stood at the edge of the trench and looked down at Elise, then along the line of the excavation toward the cabin, then back toward the cellar door half buried in the slope. "Your shoulders are square," he said. Elise looked up. Sweat ran into her eyes. "What?" "The trench shoulders. You are cutting them square. They will collapse." His accent was French-Canadian, and the words came slowly, as if he were translating not from another language, but from a deeper certainty. "A square shoulder catches rain and its own weight. You need a slight arch. Even 6 inches of curve throws the pressure outward instead of down." "Boards are easier than stone," Elise said. "Easy things fall on people." She climbed out of the trench. He was already crouching at the edge, running his thumb along the cut where the wall met the surface. He pressed, and a chunk of clay the size of his fist broke free and tumbled to the trench floor. "You see?" he said. "The clay is dry. When it rains, it swells. When it dries again, it cracks. A square corner gives it permission to fall. A curve makes it lean on itself." He looked at her. His eyes were the color of old limestone, gray with flecks of something lighter underneath. "What are you building?" he asked. She told him. The cellar, the trench, the draft, the floor gate, the roof vents. She told him about her father and the dairy cellar and the flame that leaned toward the dark. She told him about Lucien and the heat and the $47 and the 54 days that were now 35. Odrin listened without interrupting. When she finished, he walked to the cellar door, opened it, and descended the limestone steps. He was underground for nearly 5 minutes. When he came back up, he carried the cold on his clothes the way a man carries river water after a crossing, visible in the damp, present in the air around him. "The sump is good," he said. 44 degrees. "The limestone holds moisture. You have winter ice still packed under straw at the north end." "Yes." "How long is the trench when finished?" 50 feet. "And the cabin end? You have planned a gate?" "A hinged square in the floor, sealed with leather scraps." Odrin nodded slowly. "The gate cannot simply open and shut. You need 3 positions, closed, half, full, and the roof vents need cowls, tin hoods angled away from the prevailing wind. Otherwise, a strong gust pushes hot air backward down through the cabin and into the trench. Elise had not considered wind reversal. She had thought of the system as a one-way flow, cold air in from below, hot air out from above. But wind is not courteous. Wind pushes wherever it finds an opening. "I do not have tin for cowls," she said. "You have stovepipe. Stovepipe bends." He set his mason's bag on the ground. "I am looking for work. I built ice houses on the Missouri and stone cellars around St. Joseph. I came west for railroad repair, but the crew disbanded at Great Bend. I will work for meals and a place to put my bedroll." Elise studied him. She had learned in 11 months on the Kansas prairie to read offers the way she read weather, not by what they promised, but by what they carried underneath. "Why?" she said. "Because you're doing something I understand, and you're doing it wrong in 3 ways I can fix." He was not smiling. He said it the way a mason says a wall is out of plumb, without judgment, as a fact that required correction. Elise looked at Lucian, who had come out of the cabin holding his lard pail. The boy looked at Odrin's mason's bag, the way children look at things they want to understand. "You can sleep in the lean-to behind the cellar," Elise said. "Meals are thin." "I have eaten thin before." He set his bedroll in the lean-to that afternoon, and by dusk he had shown her the first of 3 things that would keep the trench from killing her. The first teaching was cribbing. Elise had been using cottonwood boards laid flat against the trench walls and held in place by cross pieces wedged between them. The method worked in stable clay, but failed wherever the soil changed composition. At the gravel seam, the boards bowed inward under lateral pressure, and the cross pieces, cut straight, transmitted the force through the center instead of distributing it along the frame. Odrin showed her a different approach. He notched the cross pieces with a chisel so that each end sat in a shallow groove cut into the side board. When pressure pushed inward, the notch caught it and transferred the load into the frame as compression instead of shear. The difference was the difference between pushing against a door and pushing against a wall. He demonstrated on a single 4-foot section. He cut the notches in 12 minutes. Elise cut her first set in 40. By her third set, she was down to 20, and the cross pieces locked into the sideboards with a sound like a drawer closing. Firm, seated, finished. "The notch does the work," Odrin said. "You just hold the wood still." The second teaching was drainage. Elise had laid a shallow gutter down the center of the trench, lined with broken crockery. It drained well enough during dry weather, but would turn into a channel for stormwater if the trench ever flooded again. Odrin showed her how to add a layer of gravel beneath the crockery and slope the gutter toward a sump jar buried near the cellar entrance. The jar could be emptied daily. More importantly, the gravel layer allowed groundwater seepage to drain below the walking surface of the trench instead of collecting on it. "Water in a trench is not just wet," he said. "It is weight. It pushes walls. It softens clay. It turns a passage into a mouth that swallows itself." He crouched in the trench and pressed his palm against the floor. "Feel this. Dry. Good. Now feel after a rain." He poured a cup of water onto the crockery. It drained through the gravel and disappeared. "The water goes down. The air stays clean. You are building a road for air, not a canal for rain." The third teaching came 3 days later, and it concerned the thing Elise had not yet built, the draft control system. She had planned a simple hinged gate in the cabin floor, open or closed. Odrin told her that was like having a well with no bucket. "You need to control the draw." He cut a piece of scrap pine into a small model gate with 3 notched positions, closed, sealed tight with a leather gasket. Half, a 4-inch gap that allowed a measured flow of cold air. Full, the gate folded back entirely, opening the trench mouth to the cabin floor. "You will learn to read the draft the way you read a stove damper," he said. "Too much cold air too fast and you drain the cellar. Too little and the cabin does not cool. The half position is your working position. Full is for emergencies. When someone is sick, when the heat will kill." He built the notch mechanism from a strip of oak and 2 wooden pins. It took him an afternoon. Elise watched every cut and memorized the spacing. "Why 3 positions?" Lucian asked, sitting cross-legged at the trench edge with his pail in his lap. Odrin looked at the boy. "Because the cold in that cellar is not endless. It is stored, like money in a tin. You spend it all in the morning, you have nothing for the afternoon. 3 positions let you spend wisely." The metaphor landed. Elise heard it and understood that Audrin was not just teaching construction. He was teaching the logic of a system, inputs, outputs, reserves, and the discipline to manage them. They dug together through the first week of July. Audrin worked with an economy that made Elise feel wasteful. Where she swung the mattock in broad arcs, he chipped in short, controlled strokes that removed exactly the amount of material he wanted. Where she shoveled loose, fill in heaping loads that spilled over the blade. He scooped measured amounts and placed them on the spoil pile in a pattern that kept the pile stable and the working area clear. He did not correct her constantly. He corrected her once, showed the alternative, and then let her practice until the new method became reflex. If she reverted to the old way, he said nothing. He waited until she noticed the difference herself. By July 5th, 34 feet of trench lay open, cribbed, and sealed. 16 feet remained. 28 days until the deadline. The ratio had swung in their favor, but the remaining ground was the hardest. A layer of calcium-crute hardpan that formed naturally in the semi-arid soil and required the mattock pick to fracture before the shovel could move it. Odrin's arms failed him on the hardpan. He was 63, and his shoulders could not sustain the overhead strikes the calcium layer demanded. He sat on the trench edge, breathing hard, and said, "My arms remember more than they can do." Elise took the mattock. She struck. The pick bounced. She struck again. A chip flew. She struck a 3rd time, and the fracture widened. After 30 minutes, she had broken through a section the width of her body and 4 inches deep. The hardpan was 8 inches thick. Beneath it lay soft brown clay that the shovel could handle. 2 days for 1 foot, she said. "Then take 2 days, Odrin said. "The trench does not care about your calendar." But the calendar cared about her. Cale Bristow rode past the cabin twice that week. The second time, 2 of his men dismounted and walked along the trench line. One of them stepped on an unbraced section and caved in the wall. He said it was an accident. Odrin said nothing. He watched the men ride away, then picked up the collapsed boards and began resetting the cross pieces. "He wants you to stop," Odrin said. "I know. He does not want the debt paid. He wants the cellar." "I know. Then you need to finish before he finds a reason to take it." The cave-in cost them a day and a half. Elise repaired the section while Odrin reinforced the next 8 feet with doubled cross pieces, heavier, slower to build, but capable of holding even if a horse stood on the surface above. Dr. Pike returned on July 10th. He examined Lucian. The boy was thinner but not feverish, and his urine had lightened, and then walked the length of the trench. He stood at the open cabin end and looked down at the cribbed passage, disappearing into the earth toward the cellar. "It is well built," he said. This surprised Elise. But well built does not mean it will work. You are counting on a temperature difference to move enough air through 50 feet of narrow passage to cool a room that reaches 95 degrees by noon. The physics may be sound, the scale may not. We will test it, Elise said. And if it fails? Then I have a very well-built ditch. Pike did not smile. The boy is holding, barely. 2 more weeks of this heat and I cannot guarantee he holds. You need shade, moving air, or a different house. You have chosen moving air. I hope you are right. He left. Elise watched the dust settle and felt the doubt that had lived in her chest since the first night she drew the trench in Abel's ledger. The doubt did not speak in her father's voice. It spoke in her own. What if the flame leaned because of a crack in the wall and not because of the law her father described? What if 50 feet was too far and 30 inches too narrow? What if the air moved but not enough, and she had spent 2 months digging a monument to grief? She went back to the hardpan. She swung the mattock. The doubt stayed, but so did she. By July 20th, the trench was 44 feet long. 6 feet remained. 12 days until the deadline. The cabin end was complete. The floor gate sat in its oak frame, sealed with leather scraps and flour paste. The 3-notch positions tested and retested by Odrin until the mechanism operated silently. The roof vents rose from each gable end, stovepipe sections topped with tin cowls that Odrin had bent and riveted from salvaged sheet metal. They looked ugly. Cale called them widow chimneys when he rode past. The cellar end was the final challenge. The trench had to enter the cellar wall through a stone-lined opening near the sump, where the coldest air pooled. Cutting through limestone with hand tools was not the same as cutting through clay. Odrin used a cold chisel and a 2-pound hammer, working in the cellar by lantern light, while Elise finished the last 6 feet of earthwork above. Lucian held the lantern for Odrin. The boy had become the old man's shadow, carrying tools, fetching water, asking questions that Odrin answered with the patience of a man who had never had a child ask him anything before and found the experience unexpectedly valuable. "Why does cold air stay at the bottom?" Lucian asked. "Because it is heavy. Warm air is light. They are like 2 people trying to use the same door. The heavy one goes low, the light one goes high, and if you build the door right, they pass each other without fighting. What if you build it wrong? Then they fight, and nobody moves, and the room stays hot." The cellar opening was completed on July 23rd. Odrin fitted a punch-tin screen across the mouth to keep rodents from nesting in the trench. Elise sealed the final joints with clay and packed the earth over the last section of cribbing. The spoil pile behind the cabin was the size of a small wagon. The trench was covered, sealed, and connected 50 feet of buried passage from cellar sump to cabin floor, sloping downward at a grade Elise had checked with a water-filled glass tube every 4 feet. They stood in the cabin. The floor gate was closed. The roof vents were capped. The trench was a sealed passage beneath their feet, invisible except for the square of oak in the floor framed with leather gaskets. Odrin looked at Elise. "Are you ready?" She was not ready. She had spent 46 days digging, cribbing, sealing, and losing sleep, and now the answer to every question was behind a hinged piece of pine. She knelt. She lifted the gate to the first notch, half open, a 4-inch gap. Nothing happened. She waited. Odrin crouched and held a candle stub near the gap. The flame stood upright. Elise's stomach fell. Then the flame shivered. Then it leaned toward the gap, drawn down by the cooler air beginning to move through the passage below. It was not dramatic. It was not a rush of cold wind. It was a whisper, a slow, steady draw of dense cellar air climbing the trench and sliding across the cabin floor like water across a shallow pan. Odrin placed his palm on the floor,